Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of the Mastodon podcast. I'm your host, Molly Sall, here with my co-host, Dan. Say hi, Dan.
Hi.
Today, we are going to be talking about Dan's top 3 favorite Appian features of 2024. So, Dan, before we get into the top 3, let's talk about the guys who didn't make it. Anything that Appian released this year that people might be surprised didn't make your list?
For sure. Appian in 2024, they released something called Case Management Studio. If you've tuned into any of the release webinars in 2024, you've definitely heard of this one. They're making a lot of changes and features related to Case Management Studio. But to be honest, I haven't been super impressed with it, and I've had a hard time seeing when it would actually fit a use case better than just building something with Appian more custom. So sadly, Case Management Studio, I know Appian's putting a lot of work into it, but did not make my list.
Wow, even with the drag and drop functionality of Case Management Studio, it didn't make the top 3?
No, I mean, it does some cool stuff. I can't deny that some of it does seem cool. But again, it feels like there's still a lot of extra work that you need to do even after you use some of the cool drag and drop generalized structure that it provides, to the point where I would almost always rather just build something from scratch and have more control over it and have it do what I actually need it to do from the beginning.
Gotcha. Well, maybe in 2025 they'll add some cool features, and when we do this list next year, it'll be up there.
Yeah, I hope so. I know they're continuing to invest in it, so hopefully it does get to a better state. But for now, no thank you.
All right, so no Case Management Studio. Any other cool features that didn't make the list?
There are a few other cool features. Process autoscaling just barely didn't make my top 10. I think there's a lot of potential with process autoscaling. It came out in 24.4, but it's still very early on. I've heard mention that it's kind of similar to when synced records, data fabric came out initially, and there was clearly a lot of potential, but it was very, very limited. I think process autoscaling is in the same state, where they're going to continue to add a lot more to it over the next few releases, and it's going to become really powerful, but a little too early to use it right now.
Yeah, it would certainly be cool to see what it can do a couple years in action, but right now it does seem pretty limited to Community Edition and not much else.
I haven't been able to get access to it on our own environments yet. You can play around with it on Community Edition, but there's still a lot of unknowns for me, a lot of questions on exactly how it works and when you would want to use it. So I am holding off until maybe another release or two.
Well, let's move on from the have-nots and get into the haves. Without further ado, let's get started with your top 3. So tell us about what's third on that list.
All right. Number 3 is portals are now embeddable on your own external websites using iframes. So portals came out a few years ago, opened the door to a lot of cool new use cases because you could have unauthenticated users interact with Appian through a portal, but it was always its own separate dedicated URL for that portal. Now with 24.4, you can actually embed your portal interfaces within another site like your main business website.
So the benefit of portals just in a different URL?
Basically, it's a portal within an existing website. So it's going to allow you to create much more seamless experiences. You can imagine, you might have a website that you use for all of your business, but you want to have a form that somebody can submit if they have, maybe they want to request a quote or something. You could do this with portals, but before you would need to have a link from your website, and that would take the user to a different URL to load up the portal, and that's where they could submit their request for a quote. Now you can have that quote request form directly within your website. And from the user's perspective, they're not even going to realize it's a portal or it's some other technology. They're just going to think it's part of the website.
Secret Appian. I think, honestly, probably the best way to use Appian.
Yeah, me too.
All right, so that's number 3. I'm sure number 2 is really going to blow us out of the water.
Oh boy, it's not. This is actually one that is on the list because it makes me really happy, but I'm sure a lot of people are going to disagree with this being so high up on the list. It is the ability for you to specify default test cases on expression rules, and now that you can select your test cases from a drop-down directly in the ad hoc test view rather than needing to switch over to the test case view.
So just to clarify, test cases have always been around. Specifically, what made your list is the fact that now you can have defaults and select them from the dropdown.
Correct. So functionality is pretty similar to how it's always been. You can now just interact with it much more quickly and much more easily. And the reason why that puts it at number 2 on my list is because despite how valuable everybody agrees that test cases are, I don't see them getting used as consistently as they should be to really maximize the value that you get out of them in terms of code understanding and maintainability. And so my hope is that with this small change that's making it a little bit more accessible, a little bit more easy to use, that more people are going to buy into it and actually use it more consistently on their projects.
And obviously, this isn't going to affect us at all because we always write test cases for all of our expression rules.
Yeah, very true. I consistently use test cases and put them on all of my expression rules. It's really when I'm code reviewing somebody else, maybe someone named Molly Sall, looking at their code, seeing they've created these expression rules with no test cases, and it really bumps me out because they really are really useful and people just, I don't think, feel the value because it's been so clunky in the past.
Are you saying that you have a problem with copy of unnamed test case, which just checks if all of the test inputs are null, if there's no error? Is that not an effective test case?
You know, I think this is another great point, Molly. This feature, and hopefully the fact that people should be using them more consistently going forward, is going to spawn some of these important discussions around best practices for naming and also like how to properly configure a test case so it does more than just check if null values error the expression rule or not.
Well, I'm definitely excited to see this brand new world of people writing test cases for their code.
Me too.
Perfect. Well then, without further ado, let's move on to your top 1 favorite new feature in Appian from 2024.
Top 1 favorite feature is dynamic URL parameters for sites. So in 23.4, Appian added the ability to site pages where you could now have inputs to your site pages. And with that, you could specify in your URL the values that you want to pass into those inputs. So basically, in your URL, you could have a site page load and render while evaluating whatever inputs you've provided. So that was pretty cool. But in 24.2, they made it way, way better in that now as you actually interact with that page after it's loaded, you can actually see the URL parameters dynamically update as their values change while you're interacting with that page. And that opens the door for a lot of cool new use cases.
Like what?
Great question, Molly. Thanks for asking. So I know a lot of people like to, in Appian, using custom components, you can imagine like a little sidebar component or breadcrumbs or whatever, and that's usually all handled within local variables. So a big complaint that people have is that if you've navigated down to some page in your site and you want to share that link with a colleague, you can't just copy the URL and send that over to somebody or bookmark it for your own later use because all of that navigation has occurred in local variables. Now, if you use these URL parameters instead of local variables to handle things like navigation and searching and filtering, you can actually have dedicated URLs for the state of your page, making it much easier to save those URLs, bookmark them, share them, whatever you want to do.
That's super cool. So in the past, where creating custom filters would have been, you would have to create a table and a process model to write to it. Now you can just store all of that in your URL, bookmark it, and bam, get to your filter, get to your record or your subpage or wherever you're trying to go.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. You're going to save a lot of development time in some cases because you can, avoid creating these custom components and just using URL parameters to accomplish the same thing. And I think users are going to be a lot happier as well. Because another point is that it's not just that they update as you interact with the form, but it also lets you use the back button on your browser more than you could before, because you can actually go back and it'll take you back to the last URL, which is effectively, undoing whatever your last interaction was on the site. And that's been really nice for a couple reasons. One is that you have much more readable URLs. So for example, we have an Appian releases page where we have our notes on the different releases. And they're backed by records, but instead of having a record URL, I can just go to, the site page /release number equals 24.2, and it'll show me the record view for 24.2, which is really just a custom interface. So I find that really nice that you can have these very readable URLs rather than the, nonsensical, longer encrypted URLs.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your top 3, Dan. Any other final thoughts on 2024 or 2025?
So the 2025 or 25.1 release webinar was yesterday. Shout out to drag and drop grid rows. Finally, we've been asking for drag and drop components in Appian for years, and they finally did it. So thank you, Appian.
Wow. If you take one thing from this episode, I hope that it is drag and drop is coming and not just to Case Management Studio. Well, thank you so much for joining us. See you guys next time on our future episodes of Mastodon Podcast.